Hey everybody, this is Dr. Everson bringing you a lecture on Leviticus, Everybody's favorite book of the Bible. I shouldn't make light of Leviticus. Of course, it's an important book, but for a lot of folks, Leviticus is where they might become a little discouraged with their reading plan. Some folks plan on reading through the Bible in a year. They might start in January and begin aggressively reading through the Old Testament, and when they come to Leviticus, they just they can't finish. Well, Leviticus and Numbers, for that matter. And of course, that's the focus for this week would be the books of Leviticus and Numbers. So hopefully some of this information will be useful to you, and it'll help you better understand the book of Leviticus, or might make Leviticus a little more enjoyable to study and to analyze. I think it does get at sort of the relationship between the Creator and His creation, and important ideas of holiness and law and atonement, and the things that are so important to the spiritual life as Christians. Some of the foundational aspects of that are set forth here in Leviticus. Okay, well, to start off, it has a funny name, Leviticus. This comes from the Septuagint, Levitikon in Greek, or Leviticus in Latin, refers to that which pertains to the Levites. So it's a book written for the Levites, is what the Septuagint, the Western Septuagint and the Western Vulgate, this is the title that it gives to it. Strangely, or maybe not so strangely, in the original Hebrew, the title is Vayikra, often spelled with a W, reflecting the Ashkenazic pronunciation Vayikra, which means "and he called," because this is how the book of Leviticus begins. And the Lord called to Moses is the first line in Leviticus. Of course, this is how all of the books of the Pentateuch are entitled. They're entitled by their one of the first words in the first verse. So Bereshit, in the beginning, is the name of the book of Genesis. So the same applies here to Leviticus. So that's where the name comes from. One thing that's helpful in understanding Leviticus is just the theology of holiness. And this can be sort of hard to get your head around in a way, although it's like one of those things where it's sort of deep, but it's also sort of simple. The basic theology of Leviticus is a theology of holiness. And in a number of instances, and these are mentioned in your textbook, but I'll just list a few of them here. There's this idea that the Israelites should be holy because their God is holy. So you can find this in Leviticus 11:45 and 19:2 and chapter 20, verse 26. So it's a repeated theme within Leviticus. Well, and so that's why we have all of these laws about holiness, right? There's how the priests should be holy, and how the sacrifices should be holy, and how all sorts of things should be holy. And that sort of makes us ask the question, well, what does it mean for something to be holy? And the basic word for holiness that you find in the Old Testament is kadosh. Kadosh is a great adjective that shows up all throughout the Old Testament. Famously in Isaiah 6, you have Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzebaot, or Holy, Holy, Holy is the Lord of hosts. And what does it mean for something to be holy? Well, the etymology of the word Kadosh, of course, comes from the verb Kadash, which means to separate. So it's the basic idea that God wants the Israelites to live a separate life, and separate could mean a number of things. They should be distinct from their neighbors who don't live holy lives. They should separate themselves, dedicate themselves to the Lord. So another word for holy could be dedicated. And so there's special ways you should eat, there's special ways you should live, And there's certain things that take you away from that state of dedication, or they make you unholy. And that's what Leviticus is all about, trying to be dedicated unto the Lord, or dedicated to the Lord. And of course, this is, something that we as Christians are concerned about too, right? We want to live lives that are honoring to God. We want to live lives that are dedicated to God. In fact, you might be listening to this right now, watching this, taking notes on this, because you're seeking to dedicate your life, your spiritual life, your professional life, whatever, you're seeking to dedicate it to God. And so Leviticus, though it can be difficult to read, especially when you get into like skin diseases in chapter 13 or whatever, this really fits with sort of what we're all about, those of us in this arena. So anyway, that's the basic theology behind Leviticus, the theology or the philosophy or the ideology. Okay, and then sacrifice. What is the purpose, the meaning of sacrifice? And I'll keep this very simple and very short. There's basically three types of sacrifices that you see in the Old Testament, or three ideas of sacrifice. There's five or six different types, but sort of three meanings or ideas behind sacrifice. One would be the idea of a gift, like you give a gift to the Lord. So you are productive in your life, you have resources that have been given to you and you make good use of those, and you seek to give back some of those resources to God in some way, shape, or form. And so this would be a sacrifice. You give grain. In the ancient world, what were the resources? You would give your animals, you would give your grain, you could give a drink offering, you would give these things back to the Lord. Another one, which is a little more fun, would be the idea of fellowship. And I find folks in churches often don't quite get the idea of sacrifice as fellowship, or sacrifice as feast, or sort of a holy barbecue. But this was common in the ancient world, and the Israelites are similar to their neighbors in this idea, or in this way. So the priest would often offer up only part of the animal. They might offer up the icky bits, and then the yummy bits would be consumed by not only by the priests, but by the people who came there. And so imagine an animal is sort of ritually slaughtered in a way where some of it is offered to God. Sorry, I'm at the church and the phone rang. Yes, the idea of fellowship. So the icky bits would be offered up to the god, and then the yummy bits would be consumed by the priest and by those who came for the festival, right? And so there's festivals that are described in the Old Testament. And what kind of festival would they be if there was no food involved, right? I mean, think of any church gathering where you have food, and how meaningful and wonderful that is. That same dynamic would occur in the ancient world as well. So the idea of fellowship, which is really quite wonderful. And then also this idea of covenant renewal, that the sacrifice is a way of reconciling the status of the Israelites before their God. So because of their sins, they have become distant from God, and as a result of the sacrifice, their status has been rectified, has been improved, as they have been reconciled. Your textbook describes some of this, and I've got sort of a handy chart. I don't know if you remember the chart that I provided for you on the ancient Near East. It included, I think, 3 or 4 different charts in there that are just sort of handy things to refer to. I have a handy chart describing the sacrificial system in the Old Testament, and I'll list off 5 different offerings here that are also covered in your textbook. There's the so-called burnt offering, and I think this is what most people consider. or this is what comes to mind for most people when they think of sacrifices. Like you take the cow, you throw it up there on the altar, and you just burn that puppy till there's nothing left and it's entirely consumed. And that's what a burnt offering is. It's the Hebrew term is olah, and the sacrifice entirely sort of ascends on the altar. And the occasion for this would be, as it says on the chart here, propitiation for general sin, or it demonstrates dedication, and it's described in the first chapter of Leviticus. The second type of offering here is not a grand offering, which sounds like something you would apply for through the National Endowment for Humanities or something. It's a grain offering, so forgive the typo on the screen there. A grain offering or a meal offering. And this would be something where a portion of it would be given on the altar to God, and then the other portions would be consumed by the priests. And of course, this is how the priests survive, right? So the priests are not farmers. They don't have a livelihood to sustain themselves. They're sort of supported by the other tribes, right? And this is, when you look at the tribal allotments, right? Remember the Ephraim and Manasseh, the sons of Joseph. Those are two tribes that sort of get Joseph's portion, allotted portion, is doubled between two of his sons, and then the tribe of Levi is granted the priesthood. So this is, the grain offering is the principal way in which the priests are able to sustain themselves. In addition to that, we have the so-called peace offerings, which comes from the Hebrew word shalom. Some people we'll talk about thank offerings, votive offerings, or offerings of or vow offerings, free will offerings. These are these pertain to fellowship, right? It would be the idea that the fatty portions, as I said before, the icky bits, are offered up on the altar, which of course smells wonderful, and that's something that the Bible talks about, how God enjoys the smell of the offering. And sometimes I think about that when my neighbors, or when myself, when I'm barbecuing, just the smell of the meat cooking. No offense to those who don't enjoy meat, but if God didn't want us to eat meat, why did He make animals out of food? I'm just kidding. But this is something you see in the Old Testament, the idea that the fat portions are burnt up. So the fat portions are burned, and then there's a meal that's shared by the priest and those who are bringing the offering. There is the so-called sin offering, and this would apply to a situation where purification is needed, and this is where the fat portion would be offered up, but here the other portions are consumed by the priest. So this would be similar to the grain, aka grant offering mentioned before. And then lastly, we have the guilt offering, which is similar to the sin offering. The grant offering applies to a situation where there has been desecration or desacralization, as the handout says, of something holy, or where there is objective guilt. And this is similar to the sin and the grain offering. The part of it, namely the fatty portions, are offered up on the altar, and then the remaining portions are consumed by the priest. And so those would be 5 types of sacrifices that are offered up. Okay, moving on from there. What is the main task of priests? The main task of priests, it's pretty simple. And of course, you can find this throughout the book of Leviticus. The purpose of the priests, or the task of the priests, is to preserve their own holiness as someone who sort of is a mediator between God and His people. The priest should remain separated or dedicated unto the Lord. So there's a lot of laws. You can see Leviticus 21 and 22. There's many laws that concern to how the priests preserve their own holiness. But then there's this idea that the priests are supposed to teach the Israelites the law, right? So they understand the law and they're responsible for teaching the law to the people. And you do have some similarities to folks who do, parish work, whether it's a Catholic priest or a Baptist pastor or, any other Protestant minister. These sorts of tasks continue today, right? People expect their religious leaders to be ones who sort of do it right. And of course, this is good and bad. It's good to have expectations for your religious leaders. Of course, they're human too, and they make mistakes. So we also should be realistic and gracious to some degree or another. But we see this, that your religious leaders are held to a standard of holiness, and they should teach others what it means to live lives that are dedicated to God. And so we see this spelled out in Leviticus, and we see it carried out today. Let me just share with you some of the similarities that I see between the ancient Near East and Israelite sacrifice. In the ancient Near East, looking at, of course, when I say ancient Near East, or when most people say ancient Near East, they're usually referring to ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia. Sometimes they might be referring to the folks up in Turkey, like the Hittites, or the Philistines, or some other cultures, but usually they're referring to Egypt and Mesopotamia. And in these cultures, we see the idea that the sacrificial offering, is a gift that's given to the God. It's a way for the people to have fellowship, have communion with one another. And so, for example, now this wouldn't be ancient Near East, this would be ancient Greek culture, but you have this idea that Prometheus tricks the gods into eating the icky bits of the gods, if you're a fan of Greek mythology at all. And of course, the gods aren't happy with Prometheus for doing this, but because of his clever thinking and his working on behalf of humanity, this is how sacrifices work for Egypt, that the gods eat part of it and then humanity shares in the rest of it. So you see this idea of communion in, I guess, not only in the ancient Near East, but you see it also in cultures to the West. There's also the idea of restoration, right? Like the God is somehow being appeased. The status of the people before their God, or the relationship between the God and the people, is somehow restored because of the sacrifice. Let me share some of the differences that I see between the ancient Near East and the Israelites. To me, these are important. I'm obviously biased. I'm a big fan of monotheism. So when I'm comparing polytheists and monotheistic Israelite culture, I'm sort of in the tank for the Israelites. But as a biased monotheist, I do see something very unique about the Israelites and what they were up to in their religious system. And one thing that I find very interesting is that the Israelites are concerned with sincerity of worship, or the God of the Israelites is concerned with sincerity of worship. And you can see this in the prophet Amos. Let me flip over there for a second. And I think I know the chapter. Yep, you see it right here in Amos chapter 5, verse 21, in which God speaks to the prophet saying, I despise your feasts. I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. And the peace offerings of your fattened animals, I will not look upon them. Take away from me the noise of your songs. To the melody of your harps, I will not listen. But let justice, or here you could translate it, judgment. This is the famous verse quoted by Martin Luther King Jr. in the I Have a Dream speech, but let judgment, mishpat, roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. So Amos is sometimes known as the social prophet. He's upset with the Israelites and their treatment of the poor. And this is the idea that God views the Israelites as being hypocritical. They're saying one thing, but they're doing another. And so God's not interested in their feasts. Now, this might seem like a small thing, but this is actually a very large idea in my mind, the idea of intent. Right? In the ancient Near East, the priests did not care about the attitude of the givers. So when they're worshiping Marduk in Babylon, the priest isn't wringing his hands over, oh, but do they really love Marduk? And because Marduk really cares about those things. You don't see that kind of language used, but you do see it in the Old Testament. Or maybe in another way, you see it in the Ten Commandments, right? So number 10, don't covet when you see your neighbor's house or wife. I mean, think about that commandment for a second, right? The commandment is saying you shouldn't really, really want things, right? So God, throughout the Old Testament, is concerned about the attitude and the desires of those who worship him. And that it's a strange thing because this appears in law, and you can't legislate people's thoughts, right? This is the strange thing in Orwell where you have the thought police, and hey sir, you've had enough to think, you better come with me. You can't exactly legislate that, but nevertheless, God is concerned about our thoughts and our attitudes and desires sincerity of worship. And of course, if you are a follower of Christ, if you are someone who reads the Bible, you understand this. Like this is very, very important. And in my mind, this sets the stage for what we see in the New Testament, where the law is written on our hearts, which of course Jeremiah prophesies. And because the law is written on our heart, we have an internal motivation for doing good things. God changes our desires, and we do good things because we want to do good things. And there's this idea of sincerity or authenticity, which is really, really wonderful. This is the goal. This is what we shoot for. Sometimes we do good things because we have to, or we feel guilty. But the best is when we do them because it's sincere and it's heartfelt. And so we see this in Israelite worship, which I think is really cool. Also, there's the idea that God doesn't become hungry, which is strange to say because we take this all for granted. And of course, we take certain monotheistic ideas for granted because they've become central to Western culture and they become central to our thinking. But in the ancient world, this wasn't a given, right? So, for example, if you look at the story of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh, of course, has a character in there who survives the flood, a gentleman by the interesting name of Utnapishtim. So he's the man who survived the flood. And once the flood had passed, of course, the gods decide that they're going to destroy all of humanity. And there's this idea in the story of buyer's remorse. That is, once they have killed off everybody, but the one man who is sort of able to outsmart them, Utnapishtim, they regret their decision because they now realize they have no way of being fed. They need humans to feed them. And this was part of the logic of sacrifice, right? Part of sacrifice was taking care of the gods who get hungry and who get thirsty. And if you don't take care of them, they become unhappy. So when Utnapishtim, when the flood is over and he descends from his ark, he offers up a sacrifice. Of course, this is similar to the biblical story. And when he offers up the sacrifice, it says that the gods descended upon the sacrifice like flies because they were just so hungry. And that's something you don't see in the Bible. In fact, you see prophets mock that idea. And I didn't hunt down any passages for this, but Jeremiah certainly makes fun of gods. Ezekiel makes fun of gods. I also think of Elijah and his contest with the prophets of Baal, right? Making fun of the God. Well, maybe he's in the bathroom because your gods have to do that thing. So anyway, in the Old Testament, you don't have this idea that God is just like we are, who has all of our physical needs. He's described as being beyond that. He's not somebody, he enjoys the smell of the sacrifice, but he doesn't need it to nourish and sustain himself. Okay, and so related to that is this next item here, do ut des. This is a great Latin phrase for those of you who've done any Latin. Way to go. Do is I give, ut is in order to, and des is the subjunctive that you may give. So I give in order that you may give. And it's sort of a, or to use another Latin phrase, you could say quid pro quo, or this for that. So in the ancient Near East, there was this idea that you would give to the gods so that they would give to you, right? Why did people go and worship Baal, right? Not because they were seeker sensitive and they just wanted to feel good inside about themselves. They went to worship Baal because they were interested in not starving. And the way you don't starve is you have your crops grow, and you need the earth to be fertilized in order for that to happen. And so they would go to the temple of Baal, and there could be temple prostitutes there helping Baal remember what his job is. Of course, Baal is symbolized as a bull, and of course there's sort of graphic imagery involved here where the sky god fertilizes, the male sky god fertilizes the female earth god, and from that you have reproduction, you have things grow, and this is what the temples were all about. You would go and you would give to the god so that the god would do his job and thereby give to you. So Baal would do his thing, which means that the crops grow and you have food, and so you give to get. And you don't see this quid pro quo, this for that idea within the Bible, right? There's no sort of guarantee that this is exactly how it's going to work. And of course, this is, I find this to be true from my own experience. It is good to give to God, and yet, well, I mean, depending on your theology, some people do have a sort of, idea that if I just give so much to such and such a preacher, then I will, I'm going to win big. But anyway, do ut des. You don't see that in the Old Testament. Okay, and then last but not least, I thought I would give you an example of a sort of comparative example of the scapegoat in the Old Testament. And I'm going to just read a selection out of a textbook. I'll include this information in one of the documents this week. I'll give you the title just verbally here. Ancient Near Eastern Thought and the Old Testament. That's the title. It's written by John Walton. And if this is something you get into, sort of looking at the historical context of biblical books, this would be almost a systematic theology of the ancient Near East, right? If you want to find a one-stop shop of a book, and I mean it's 350 pages, a one-stop shop of a book that really gets into the theology, the ideology of non-Israelite ancient Near Eastern folks who worship the gods. This is just a great resource. It's just full of about everything you can imagine. It's organized well. It's well written. John Walton is I'm a big fan. But anyway, so in this textbook on page 132, Walton quotes from a guy by the name of Milgram. And Milgram summarizes some of the similarities and differences when it comes to the idea of scapegoat. And I just think it's, illustrative of some of the trends you see, some of the general differences you see between the Israelites and their neighbors. Mesopotamian elimination rites resemble the biblical scapegoat rite in that an object that is selected to draw the evil from the affected person is consequently disposed of. The differences between them are more significant. First, in Mesopotamia, the evil removed by such rites is demonic and very real. In the Bible, while the impurity is real, it does not possess the vitality and independence of demonic evil. Second, there are no group transfer rites in Mesopotamia. The biblical scapegoat, in contrast, removes the sins of the entire nation. Third, the Mesopotamian rites seek the aid of the deities of the wilderness to accept the evils. In the Bible, the entire rite is done under the aegis of its one God. Fourth, the Bible rejects the idea of substitution, which presupposes demonic attack and the appeasement of threatening demons. That's where the quotation ends. I share that with you in that there's things in there that resonate with us as modern people. The idea that we are somehow impure before God, but our impurities, it's not a personified demon. And that's what you have in ancient Near Eastern thought, but you don't have that in Israelite thought. And so in that sense, the Bible rings, these stories in Leviticus and elsewhere ring true, 3,000, 4,000 years later. Or you have this idea of collective atonement, that God is seeking God is seeking that a whole community come to him through the scapegoat of one animal. And of course, this to me resembles what we see in the New Testament, the idea that God seeks the salvation of all peoples, right? That vision in Revelation of all tribes, tongues, nations coming to him, being united in Christ is really, really wonderful. And of course, it's done because of the sacrificial love of Christ. Okay, well, I think that's enough said about that. So anyway, that's just a short overview of the sort of things that we find in Leviticus, where the name comes from, the basic theology behind it, the three meanings, the three types of, the three ideas behind sacrifice, the 5 types of sacrifice. Remember, grain, not grant offering, the task of the priests, how the Israelites are similar to the neighbors, and most importantly, how the Israelites are different from their neighbors. So anyway, hope you guys all have a great day.